Professor Pronab Sen, former Chief Statistician of India, is joining us on Urban Debate on Mirror Now. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking with us here on Mirror Now. The Reserve Bank of India today has increased the repo rate by 50 basis points after increasing it by 40 basis points in May after an off-cycle policy meet to tame inflation. So in total, 90 basis points hike in less than 2 months. Is this sufficient?
No, I mean, clearly not. With inflation running at about 7.5%, we are still talking about a repo rate which is about 250 basis points lower than the inflation rate. So the real repo rate is still in the negative territory. So repo rate hikes will continue to happen. And there are two issues, I think, which we need to think about. And RBI, of course, needs to think about. The first, of course, is that to what level should the repo rate be brought? And the second issue is the speed at which it should happen.
What should be the correct level given the current circumstances in this calendar year itself? How much more is the need of the hour?
You know, much, of course, depends upon how inflation behaves and how you're looking at these numbers. But ideally speaking, the repo rate should be at a level where you want inflation to come down to. Now, as far as the statement of the governor this morning, the RBI is expecting the inflation rate to actually climb up during the next 2 quarters. There is the current and the next quarter, and then start coming down. So I would imagine that the repo rate will need to go up to around 6%.
So from current 4.9%, you're expecting that to deal with the current crisis that the country is facing in terms of inflation, it needs to at least go up to 6%. And do you see that happening within this calendar year, sir, with the kind of commentary we have got from the Reserve Bank of India?
It will have to be within this calendar year.
Okay. Professor Sen, first time the inflation forecast, as you also mentioned, has been increased by 1%, while the growth forecast has remained unchanged. Have we recognized how deep the inflation problem is? Because earlier it appeared when, the RBI had not increased the repo rate, when the central bank in the US had started increasing the crucial rate, the idea, most economists were of the view that probably we are slightly behind the curve, and that's why maybe there was a need for an off-cycle policy meeting. But today, going by what the RBI governor had to say, has the RBI recognized how deep the inflation problem is?
Oh, yes, it has. And it's not just slightly behind the curve. In my opinion, I'm on record on this, I've been saying that the RBI should at least change their stance at least 6 months ago. So the RBI is well behind the curve, and I think the RBI recognizes that. So they have started the process of normalization, and it seems to be very rapid. So 90 basis points within a space of a little over a month is pretty substantial.
Okay. Professor Sen, now the main reason fueling inflation seems to be Russia-Ukraine war. If it continues, should we be prepared for stagflation?
Well, this is an interesting question. So you just quoted the RBI, and you said that they have raised the inflation forecast by 1 percentage point, but they've left the growth forecast unchanged, right? Now, if the growth forecast remains unchanged, RBI is not looking at stagflation. But the peculiarity is that with a substantial raise in the repo rate and therefore there will be a cascading effect on all the interest rates in the country, one would expect the growth rate to fall. Now, the question is, fall how far? The RBI has given us no indication of that. It has not changed its growth forecast at all.
You know, why specifically I mentioned the point about growth rate, because yesterday only we had the World Bank slashing the global growth rate given the current international factors that exist. And of course, if, you know, something happening between Russia and Ukraine will have an impact on the world, it will definitely have an impact on the Indian economy as well. So are we doing enough to deal with the problems that we are facing? Because the commentary that we are getting from the government and the RBI gives us an indication that whatever is happening today in terms of inflation or the problems that the economy is facing are largely because of what's happening outside the country. Inside the country, things are looking pretty interesting. GST collections are good. Our PMI manufacturing and services is showing us good numbers. You know, things have started to pick up.
You're absolutely right. These numbers look good, but you have to remember that these numbers reflect the performance only of the corporate sector. Now, the corporate sector has been doing well. You know, after the lockdown and during the process of the lockdown, the big hit was taken by the MSME sector. So the corporates have actually gained market power. And as a result, the corporates have been able to get pricing power. They are passing on their cost increases. They are steadily making inroads into the market share of the MSMEs. All of that has been happening, and all the numbers that we are looking at now represent the corporate position. The position of the non-corporate sector and the informal sector continues to be grim. And the data that the corporates themselves are putting out in terms of rural sales is something that should ring warning bells across the country, because that's not good news. And we are again hoping that good monsoons are going to revive rural demand. The point is that agriculture now represents a minority of rural incomes. The majority is non-agricultural activities in rural India, and those are hurting and hurting badly. And interest rate increases are not going to help them.
What should be done, in your opinion? And secondly, do you think probably the way the government and the RBI finally have started realizing that there is a Mehungai problem in the country that needs to be tackled, there is also a need to now probably have a relook at how we see the rural part of the country, how we see the informal sector in the country? Because as you are suggesting, the kind of data that we are talking about is only representing a part of the economy, but there is another part of the economy probably that is suffering, and we are not able to understand how deep is the wound that the other part is currently dealing with.
This is true. Our data systems, particularly the quarterly data, the high frequency data, only picks up corporate India. We get some data on agriculture, which is not bad at all. But other than that, so we have corporate India and agriculture. The rest of the non-corporate, non-agricultural economy, our data is very, very poor. And that's where the big problem is. So up to a point, we have to go by our gut feeling, our own sort of assessment of what we think is happening, look at data points such as the sales of FMCG products in rural areas to give us a feel for what is happening. It's not exact, I mind you, but that's the best we have at the moment.
What is going to be your piece of advice in the current scenario? How should we really be, dealing with the crisis that we have in hand so that this does not, get even worse from the current levels? Because we know there is a problem. The Reserve Bank of India itself has recognized it by saying in the statement also that at least for the first 3 quarters of the current financial year, the inflation that RBI looks at, the inflation that impacts each one of us, is going to remain at least above 6%.
No, it's worse. We're going to remain well above 6%. I mean, we are already at 7.5%. RBI expects it to go up further over the next 2 quarters before it comes down. So we are looking at fairly high inflation for a little while. But I take your point. The RBI has to act, and it must act now. But we also have to realize that RBI action will have a dampening effect on growth. Right? The question is that are we willing to accept that as a cost that we have to bear in order to bring inflation under control? We can focus, and that this is the important issue, on the kind of government expenditures which encourage the non-corporate sector activities. We already do something for agriculture in terms of the MSP. But other than that, I think, again, and mind you, the government has been doing it, but perhaps they need to shift focus a little bit more and focus on things which are more localized. You're really, you're talking about not highway projects, but rural roads. We're talking about rural drinking water supply, rural housing, things of that kind, which are localized, being done by local small contractors who are sourcing their materials and labor from local small sources. That's what we need to focus on now to mitigate the negative effect of the monetary policy that has to come.
So clearly, it is a tightrope walk for the Reserve Bank of India, because on one hand, there is inflation that's going up. There is a fear that growth may come down if the external factors continue to be where they are for some more time. Professor Sen, now, is this situation unprecedented in your opinion, or do you think we've seen worse in the past?
Oh, we've seen much worse in the past. This is by no means unprecedented. But in the past, we did have a very large shock absorber, which was agriculture. Agriculture no longer is the shock absorber that it used to be. And so what has happened now is that the Indian economy has become much more sensitive to global developments. It has become much more sensitive to what is happening in markets, which is not something we faced earlier. So we have to recognize that the Indian economy has evolved enormously. And the new set of challenges requires a new set of responses. But this is by no means the worst. And it's not also a situation which other countries are not facing. The point is that, we have to recognize that efforts to break the back of the inflationary process, which the RBI needs to do, will almost certainly lead to a slowdown in the economy. And our focus should be to prevent that from hurting the most vulnerable of our people, which are those who are in the informal sector and in the micro and small industries.
Those are some pertinent points you have raised, Professor Sen. Now, since you mentioned that, agriculture today is no longer the shock absorber. Correct me if I'm wrong, but agriculture was the only sector that did well when everything was doing really badly during the pandemic period of 2 years. I mean, if you see the data also, agriculture was the only, in a way, silver lining amidst the dark clouds. Then why would you still say that it's no longer the shock absorber?
Simply because its size has shrunk relative to the magnitude of the Indian economy. So earlier, if you think about agriculture, it used to be 65% of the Indian economy, right? Now I'm talking about the 50s and early 60s. It has now shrunk to 17%. 17% cannot absorb the shocks that are happening in the remaining 83% of the economy. But if agriculture had been 50%, it could absorb a lot more of that shock.
Okay. And one last question before we let you go, and that is about what more can be done. Today, the Reserve Bank of India governor also mentioned that, center has reduced excise on petrol and diesel, something that will definitely help in softening inflation level from the current levels that we are seeing. He simultaneously mentioned that if states further reduce VAT on fuel, then that can also help us soften the inflation level. Do you think probably that is something that's also needed right now, or do you think what the center has done is sufficient for the moment? Do states have the wherewithal to slash VAT on petrol and diesel?
No, as I said, the response to the situation we are facing requires two things. One is concerted action to bring down the inflation rate, of which cutting the taxes on diesel and petrol is an important component, which the center has done, right? The RBI's monetary tightening is a second element of it. But the third element, which I just talked about, is that there is a need to support the weaker sections of our economy, which is the informal sector and the MSMEs. Now, these are sectors which can be reached only by the states. The center has very little reach in this. And therefore, if it is a question as to who cuts the budget, given the situation, my preference would be let the center do a budget cut. The states should actually stay where they are. Indeed, they perhaps should increase their expenditure.
Okay. Just one more last question. I said that was going to be my last question, but there's something that I also would like to, have your views on, and that's about urban Narega, a thought that, has come back again. We are getting some hints from the government that probably something around an urban Narega sort of a scheme could be there. And as you mentioned that we need to look at that vulnerable section right now, the informal section. So do you think something like an urban Manrega is the scheme that center can now definitely should consider? Is it that idea whose time has finally come?
No, I think the time for this idea had come a long time ago. The problem, of course, is none of us could actually figure out what the design of such an urban version of the Manrega would be. So it's a design problem. I don't think anybody questions its need. But the need is not specific to the situation we are facing today. I think the need is much more general than that, right? The point is we don't have a good working blueprint. And we cannot take the Manrega design and try and implement some twist of that in the urban areas. It's not going to work.
Absolutely. Those are some interesting points you have made, Professor Sen. Thank you very much for joining us here on Urban Debate on Mirror now this evening. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for helping us understand the current situation and giving us some ideas as well that the government and the RBI could definitely look at to tame the current inflation problem that we are all facing.
You're welcome.